670. So, in today's lesson, we're going to be comparing the North and the South. Going back to the previous lesson, because this builds on the previous lesson, uh, the last lesson talked about the causes of the Civil War and what led up to the Civil War. And just a quick reminder that the Civil War was fought between the Union and the Confederate States. And the Confederate States were a bunch of states in the South that basically removed themselves from the country and they wanted to form their own country. And the Union were the states in the North as well as California. So we're going to compare the North and the South in today's lesson. And also, in your lesson today, I attached the slides, but they're the slides for the entire unit. All right, so you have full access to the entire Civil War PowerPoint, but we're only using slides 17 to 34. All right, so those are the only slides you're using for today's lesson from 17 to 34. And I'm going to go over all these slides with you, and those are the slides that you will need to complete the classwork. So let's begin. So the North was also known as the North, or the Union. They're also known as the Federals or the Yankees, and their soldiers wore blue. So this was the Union flag, right? They were still part of the United States of America, which is why they have the American flag here. Now this is the Confederate flag, all right? So the South was also known as the South. They were also known as the Confederacy, the Rebels, and also known as the Johnny Rebels, and the soldiers. Those soldiers wore gray. Now, as you can see, if we look at the map key, the Confederate States of America are in green. So we can see that these were all the states, the Confederate states. You had Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Virginia, both Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida. All southern states. And they fought against the Union, which are all these states in blue, right? Mostly, pretty much all the North, right? But then you also had Kansas, and then you had California and Oregon, which are all along the West Coast. And the territories in red were basically territories that were not a part of the United States territory at the time, but as we all know, they eventually would become a part of the United States eventually. And the states in yellow were the states that joined the Union during the war, so they weren't there. They weren't originally Union states. All right. And then lastly, we just have a couple of border states here, Maryland and Delaware, that basically didn't choose a side. All right. So the North had 23 states, and West Virginia and Nevada are not included in this number. All right. As you can see, those were not two of the original Union states, so they weren't included in this number. So originally there were 23 Union states, as opposed to the South, which actually only had 11 states. There were only 11 Confederate states. Now let's compare the government of the North and the South. The government for the North was their government. Their capital was Washington D.C., and which is still is today, where the White House is. And the North had a working government that had been around for over 70 years. So this is the same government that we have today. For the South, their government, their capital was in Richmond, Virginia. All right. So the South had a brand new government, and the states had, in their government, the states had more power than the central government, which made collecting taxes and passing laws difficult. So it was difficult for their central government to collect taxes from their citizens. All right, so they had their own constitution, the Constitution of the Confederate States of America. Let's talk about the population. So the North had 22 million citizens, and the number continued to increase because more and more people would immigrate, come in from Europe. The South, on the other hand, only had 9 million people. And of those 9 million, more than a third of them, 3.5 million, were slaves. Let's talk about industry. So the North contained most of the nation's factories, and it also contained most of that nation's skilled workers. So they could produce all the supplies and weapons that they needed for the war. So getting whatever they needed for the war was not a problem for people in the North. Now, in the South, on the other hand, didn't have much industry at all, and they had to rely on imports for its war. So they relied on other territories and foreign countries to bring in stuff into their territories for them, war materials. And oftentimes the North would make blockades. All right, they blocked those things from getting in to those southern states. All right, and because of that, the South struggled to get a lot of their war materials because of those northern blockades. That was a very effective strategy that the North used. Transportation. So the North had an extensive railroad system, so men and supplies could be moved quickly. They also had a large group of merchant marines, so they had shipping vessels and the people that worked on them. And they had naval supremacy. The South, on the other hand, had an inadequate railroad system, which hampered the transportation of men and supplies. So there was a huge difference in the effectiveness of the railroad system between the North and the South. And the South had very few merchant ships or naval vessels. Naval vessels meaning military ships. Finances. So the North controlled most of the nation's wealth, right? And to fund the war, the North placed tariffs or taxes on imported goods. They taxed all income, and they issued paper money called greenbacks that were not backed by gold, but by the government. And they sold government bonds to banks and individuals. So this was what the paper money looked like back then. Now in the South, they were hurt by northern blockades, just like how they were for imported war materials. Same thing for here. They had a hard time getting loans from foreign banks. People in the Confederacy did not want to be taxed by the Confederate government. Now, keep in mind that the taxes that you pay to the government, um, it's because of that the government is able to provide services to those people, right? But if you don't pay your taxes, then the government cannot provide those services. So the people in those Confederate states did not want to be taxed by their central government. So to fund the war, the South raised excise taxes and they sold government bonds and issued paper money. And this is what their paper money looked like. Military forces. So many in the North, many of the experienced officers joined the Confederate Army when their home state seceded, meaning when their home state left the country. City dwellers and factory workers were not prepared for the life of a soldier, and they needed a lot of training. So people in the North were basically not war trained, right? They were experienced working in factories, but they weren't exactly trained on how to use guns and weapons. And they had to fight in an offensive war, right? Meaning that the war was not fought on their territory, but they had to go travel down south to fight on their territory. So that wasn't exactly an advantage for the North. And thinking back to when we learned about the Revolutionary War, in that sense, the Americans had an advantage back then because um, the colonies had an advantage because remember the colonies were fighting on their own territory. So it's kind of similar here. Now the North, they drafted men between the ages of 20 to 45, but those who did not want to fight could find a substitute, or they could just pay $300 and not have to fight in the war. The South had the most experienced officers, so Southern soldiers needed less training because they were accustomed or they were used to living uh, lifestyle. Their lifestyle was very outdoors, right? They were accustomed to life in the outdoors. They knew how to use weapons and they knew how to ride horses. So they had the advantage of fighting a defensive war. They were fighting on their own soil, on their own territory. The South, they drafted men between the ages of 18 to 35, except those who owned 20 or more slaves. And only about 10% of slave owners own more than 20 slaves. So, with that being said, many you can determine that many slave owners fought in the war. This is slide 35. Give me a second. All right. So that's all the slides that we're going to go over for this lesson. And all the slides that we just went over will give you all the background information you need to complete today's classwork and exit ticket. And this is really just an introduction to the North and the South. When we're talking about the Civil War, we're going to dig much deeper into it as we go through this unit lesson by lesson. We're going to learn more about all the battles, and we're really going to get more. We're going to learn this in more detail. This is really much more of an introduction. All right, and you can always feel free to read the slides before this. So, from 1 to 16, if you want more background knowledge, if you want to read ahead, feel free to. But for this lesson, 17 to 34, starting from here, 17 to 34, these are the only slides that you're really going to need to do today's work. I also specified that in the lesson direction, use slides 17 to 34. So please make sure you do that. Don't kill yourself reading the entire thing in one go. All right, it's not all meant to be done in one day. All right, now let's quickly go through the assessments. We have 3 assessments for this lesson. The classwork is going to be based on the slides that we went over just now. The exit ticket is also going to be based on the slides that we just went over. All right, 1 true or false question. And there's a homework assignment, which is due Friday. So you're going to read the article. Now, this is just a screenshot of the article. This is not the entire article. So it's not like you're going to read this and stop here. All right, the link to the whole article can be found in the lesson. It's this one. If you click on it and open it, it will open up the whole article. You just give me a second. I'll show you what it looks like. Sorry, guys. Give me a second. So this is the article. All right. So this is the entire article. The questions that the homework is going to be based on this article. And using the article, you're going to write a 1-paragraph response. By 1 paragraph, we mean at least 6 sentences, summarizing the article below. So when I say summarize, we're pretty much writing what the most important points about the article. What is the article mostly about? What did you learn from reading this article? All right, and you don't have to get into too much detail. Just summarize the main points of the article. All right, and that is all for this lesson.